Welcome to Focus Today. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson, and a delight to have back with us today Dr. Wendy Patrick. She's an attorney, ordained minister, and the author of a book that we've talked to her previously about, Red Flags, and you may want to check that one out and get a copy of it, Red Flag. But today we just want to kind of have a little conversation about her thoughts and everything what's going on with the races. Kind of an interesting political cycle, to say the least. So hi, Wendy, how you doing?
Hi, how you doing? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to see you again. Well, listen, have you ever seen a political cycle like this one?
Absolutely not, but you know, that's what makes it so interesting, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's looking like there may be more going on at that convention on the GOP side than anyone thought possible at the beginning of this race. And that's because it doesn't look like any one candidate's going to get to 1237 delegates. Now, I know both say they can, but that claim is more challenging, shall we say, each time we have another caucus. And they actually split the vote more than each of the respective candidates' supporters would have believed. Obviously, on the Democratic side, there's probably less of a contest. But you're right that it's interesting on both sides, that it's almost a surprise how both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are just doing so well with such wide swaths of the population.
Yeah, it is. It's just amazing. The whole thing has been interesting to watch. Do you think the Republicans, Wendy, can afford a broker convention?
Well, a broker convention, of course, is different from a contested convention. And what it looks like is going to happen now is if, in fact, nobody has a majority, there's going to be some conversation at that convention as to how do they decide who the nominee is. And I got to tell you, that's largely going to be due on how far ahead Donald Trump is delegate-wise than Ted Cruz. That's what it's going to decide on. Obviously, nobody expects John Kasich to place well. He's not placing well in any of the other polls. But that'll probably be decided closer in time to the convention. And I know people are threatening third-party runs, last-minute candidates. It's almost impossible to predict because, as you point out, we've never had an election like this. So some of the things that make this election unique also make it impossible to predict how things will play out at the convention.
Yeah, I was former chairman of the party for the state of Oregon for quite a few years, and I've been to several of these conventions, and I can tell you, a lot of excitement, a lot of fun, but behind the scenes, this can get a little on the hardball side. And if Trump comes in the convention just shy of the 1237, and they try to pull the shenanigan against the will of the people, I mean, the Republican Party is already in trouble. I don't know if they shoot themselves in the foot. They may be shooting themselves in a vital organ.
Right. Of course, this is the scenario where Donald Trump made the controversial comments that there would be riots, whatever he meant by that, literally or figuratively. Different people heard it differently. But nonetheless, it would be significant. Let's say that. It would be very divisive for the party. And many might view it as unfair if Trump is so far ahead. If, for example, he has 1,230 delegates or 1,210 delegates. Where do you draw the line? If you had 1,200 delegates, they're going to actually have to proceed very cautiously. And I think that's what a lot of people are talking about, is they're predicting down the line that if Donald Trump comes in so much higher delegate-wise than Ted Cruz, that they're probably going to be criticized, to say the least, very heavily if they take it to a contested convention.
Why doesn't the establishment understand why Trump is doing so well?
I think they do. And, the reason I say that is what you've seen over the last couple of months, you've seen other candidates adopt his approach. You saw Marco Rubio doing it. Didn't work out too well for him because that's not who he is. He embarrassed himself, as he put it. You saw Jeb Bush doing it early on. Again, didn't work for him. It's not his style to go after other people. You see Ted Cruz doing it. Not as much his style as some of the other candidates, again, but people understand what he's appealing to, and they want to do the same thing so they can get more votes. So they do understand. And one of the reasons they understand, because Trump's always talking about it. It's hard not to understand. Now, having said all of that, Mr. Trump also has very high negatives in certain segments of the population. His rallies have inspired rioters over the last couple of weeks. There is a very viral and vehement anti-Trump movement, both online and live. We saw them, shut down the highway in Arizona, protest in the streets of New York last weekend. And the other candidates don't have as high negatives as Trump. So that's something else. How is that going to play into the election? It's anybody's guess. Maybe it plays in more to the general than it does to the primary. It remains to be seen.
We got to see Trump in a different setting the other day when he spoke before the American-Israeli pact. He used a teleprompter. He actually sounded and looked a little bit more presidential than just flying loosely at some of his speeches. And it turned a lot of heads. I think he took a 15-minute speech. He turned it into a 40-minute speech because of standing ovations. What'd you think?
I thought that somebody has advised him, or should I say he's decided to finally take the advice of somebody that is really reassuring him that he will do well and do better than he's been doing if he behaves more presidential. And in fact, this is something Donald Trump has said. Remember, he has basically expressed that he knows how to be presidential, but he wants to close the deal first. That's the language he's been using. Once he closes the deal and wins the nomination, he said he's perfectly capable and willing to act more presidential. And perhaps that's what you saw illustrated, lest there be any naysayers that don't think he can do it, when he used the teleprompters to make a very passionate and effective speech.
Yeah, he did it. All right, let's go back to the numbers game just for a moment. Rubio's still holding on to some numbers. You certainly have Kasich holding on to some numbers. And you've got Cruz. Now, I don't know if these two guys will give their delegates or give them up and recommend them or give them to Cruz. Do you think Cruz could pull it off?
Well, because Rubio's out of the race, there are many people that are speculating that his delegates or his voters will vote for Ted Cruz because it's a better option than Donald Trump. And then there's another school of thought that says, hey, you know, some of the people that really liked Marco Rubio because he was a great candidate, he was very articulate, well-spoken, they may very well vote for Donald Trump instead of going to Ted Cruz. Nobody can assume that's where his voters are going to go. And I know we've heard much talk about, well, can we see a Cruz-Rubio ticket, and would that provide the consolidation needed to stop Trump? But maybe that's not the best way that voters want the Republicans running a race. In other words, perhaps that voters want really a choice of voting for who they think is the best leader of the free world, rather than trying to vote for somebody that'll basically prevent one of the candidates from going any farther, or at least from getting 1,237 delegates.
Interesting. All right, so it's really split the faith community, the evangelical community. Some are saying, how could you possibly vote for Trump? And some say, how can you possibly vote for Cruz? I've never seen the evangelical community so divided. What's your take?
Well, they are divided. And one of the things that we've seen is that Ted Cruz banked on winning the evangelical vote in so many states, and he didn't. And that was no doubt a surprise to the Cruz campaign. In other words, you can't take anything for granted in a race like this. There are some people that are strong evangelical Christians that maybe don't know if Donald Trump is a walking impersonation of Jesus Christ. Okay, that's not what most people think. Nonetheless, they believe that his policies are more in line with the conservative base, with conservative views, than Ted Cruz. So that may be one explanation for why Donald Trump has really vacuumed up so many evangelical votes, much to the surprise of Ted Cruz's camp.
Were you surprised at the little bit of a faith wars that went on between Glenn Beck and Pastor Robert Jeffress?
I am never surprised when faith wars go on, regardless of who the players are. You know, it's one of those things that's got to happen because faith is very important. That's a good thing that we're talking about faith. I mean, worst case scenario, it wouldn't be factoring into the presidential race at all. God forbid we should ever become a country where people don't talk about the evangelical vote and the evangelical voter, what kind of president that person would want. So I'm not surprised. In fact, I think healthy dialogue on some of this is what a lot of the voters want, because only then can they make an educated choice as to who to vote for. In other words, they're not going to do it simply because Mr. Trump says the Bible is his favorite book or because he miscites 2 Corinthians. They don't care so much about that if his policies give them and their children the kind of comfort and security that they're looking for, and opportunity that they're looking for in the next commander-in-chief.
Interesting. All right, one more question before we take a break. 2 big primaries yet to go, California and Nevada. It would appear they would lean towards Trump. Would you agree?
You know, if you asked me that 6 months ago, I probably would have agreed more readily, because what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is Ted Cruz really continues to win a lot more caucuses and primaries than a lot of people suspected, especially since Marco Rubio got out of the race. So it is more challenging. And that means Donald Trump has to really get his game together, which no doubt is one of the reasons you saw him really putting on that presidential press conference, even though it meant using a teleprompter, that's great. That is a filter. That is something that prevents him from just going and speaking off the cuff. That's what he needs to do if he's going to win over such a broad spectrum of voters. So speaking of California and some of the other caucuses and primaries that were made to be left, it's probably going to depend a lot on whether Donald Trump keeps up this more presidential image, or whether, God forbid, he says or does something that causes a lot of voters to fall away, as has happened in some of the things he said in the past.
All right, so the jury's still out. Let me take a break here. Wendy, when we come back, a couple of questions. I'm amazed. You have the oldest candidate in the race appealing to the youngest demographic. And now we got wives wars going on between Cruz and Trump. Maybe you can comment on that. We'll be right back with Dr. Wendy Patrick in just a moment.
I'm Paulina Leiser, producer of Focus Today. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure to check our other videos at theDove.us.
Welcome back, and what a delight to have back with us today Dr. Wendy Patrick. She's an attorney. She's an ordained minister. She's authored a book. It's a great read. It's called Red Flags. You may want to check that out at Amazon. By the way, you can correspond with her, wendypatrickphd.com. wendypatrickphd.com. Well, Wendy, it got a little touchy yesterday between Cruz and Trump and their wives. Is this below the line?
We don't want to see the family members of a candidate being brought into the mud. Nobody wants to see that. You know, the candidate's family members should be off limits. That's one of the things that many Americans have been very vocal about in the last couple of days. And what you've seen is a lot of the people that work for the candidates have, disclaimed responsibility. Well, I didn't know about that. I didn't think that was, everybody backpedals after something like this gets released. So there's and remember, we heard the same argument being made by Ted Cruz very effectively when there was that ad that was run about his two girls. So it's the same kind of backlash now that both of their wives have been brought, I should say, into the limelight. They should be able to have lives, raise their children, enjoy life, be supportive to their respective spouses without having to worry about this kind of press.
Yeah, here's where I was really disappointed. Now, the rules say that a super PAC and the candidate can't collaborate. I get that, but that doesn't preclude them finding out what the next ad's going to be. And I don't know why Ted Cruz doesn't at least come out and apologize.
Well, that's what the call is right now. The call is to come out and apologize. Remember, Ted Cruz apologized before when some things occurred. Remember the false information about Ben Carson. There was a couple other instances. I haven't heard Donald Trump apologize for anything, but we're not at the primary yet. But you're right. That's one of the things that people are clamoring for. Is an apology goes a long way. We are a very forgiving society, and mea culpa is very endearing. In other words, you never exactly can keep track of some of the bad press that some of your, whether it's a super PAC or people that are working for you. Now, I know that there are people that argue the other side of that, and they argue, oh, give me a break. The candidates don't know what kind of ads are coming out. So there's two very vocal sides to this argument. As a lawyer, it's interesting to sort of argue both of them. But that's really the basis of the outrage. Is there are some people who believe that regardless if he knew about it or not, he should apologize.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move over to the left just for a moment. I am surprised that the oldest guy in the candidate, Bernie Sanders, 74, has got all the millennials waving his flag. I would assume this is like, 3 or 4 generations now of academic indoctrination and propaganda. I know. What is it?
It's ironic. It's ironic that Bernie Sanders is seen as a fresh face to the young people. He's different. He's unique. They like what he says. And I don't just mean free college. He has a lot of idealism that many young people really like. And what people are talking about now, though, is where would his voters go if he was not the nominee? Would they necessarily go to Hillary simply because that's another Democrat? Or do the types of things that these young voters are looking for, the types of things that get them excited, that they want to see happen for our country, do they believe Donald Trump is the better candidate to deliver what they're looking for in a president? And I know there's been lots of polling, but it's really tough with everybody still in the race to really understand for sure where those votes would go if the field were further narrowed. And obviously we're going to get there eventually. Now it's all just speculation. But it is ironic, and it does have something to do with the level of energy that Bernie Sanders brings. I mean, some of his rallies are like rock concerts. I mean, there are just people everywhere. There's music, there's celebrations. It really is exciting, and that's appealing to young people.
All right, now let's go over to Hillary just for a moment. I was reading the other day that you're an attorney, so maybe you can help me figure this out. But the Department of Justice is giving consideration or putting together a potential grand jury that could get some immunity to Huma to have her speak under oath before a grand jury.
Right. You know, we've been talking about this for quite a while. You know, you hear the word immunity, and the connotation it has is guilt, right? Immunity is, you know, being able to prevent being on the stand and incriminating yourself. It would be like sometimes, you know, you'd have to invoke the Fifth Amendment if you got asked to testify, but immunity prevents all of that. But we don't know what the scope and what the substance of that testimony would be. Remember, you know, talk about loud voices on both sides that couldn't be farther apart. Hillary is vocal, very vocal, about the fact that she is not worried at all about this FBI investigation. Whereas Ted Cruz, to give an example, he's been talking about it for months now, is almost certain that she's going to be indicted, and Donald Trump to a lesser extent. So you couldn't be more farther apart when it comes to what the different candidates believe is going to happen. However, the fact that this black cloud is following her throughout the campaign is something that perhaps might explain why so many more people are voting for Bernie Sanders, because while you really don't know what's there completely in Hillary's camp, it really is refreshing, if you will, to know that you can put your support behind a voter that you like. I'm talking about Bernie Sanders. This is the words of some of the young people that isn't worried about a criminal indictment.
All right. So, but help me a little bit as an attorney, because it looks like law and politics got mixed up here and will be. You got the FBI doing the investigation, and if they come up with enough evidence to recommend to the DOJ, Department of Justice, for an indictment, but they don't do it for political reasons, what happens?
Well, a lot of outrage, as you can imagine, and there have been instances where that's occurred. I mean, that happens at the state level, it happens at the federal level. You know, there's prosecutorial discretion, which means for a variety of reasons, prosecutors can decline to file a case. Again, though, you know, because this is an active investigation, it's impossible to predict whether or not that scenario is realistic here. In other words, with such a high-profile candidate and such a high-profile investigation, is it realistic to assume that the Department of Justice would not follow the recommendation of the FBI? Many people would say no, but I got to tell you, you know, as we've sort of been discussing, the theme that's permeating this whole election cycle is unpredictability. So, you know, having said what usually happens in criminal cases, both on the state and federal level, it's impossible to predict what will happen with this particular case involving Hillary Clinton.
Got to be pressure on both of these as to when they come up with this, if they do come up with a recommendation. Do they do it sooner than later? Some people are saying the best damage to Hillary would be to leave her in the race and do it just before the election, somewhere between September and November. Others would say, no, that's too political. They need to do it now. What's your thinking?
I think you just answered the question. There are two very good schools of thought on the timing of a potential indictment should we come to that, should the FBI come to that, and should the DOJ decide to proceed. There is no good time is another way to express it sort of as an easy answer. There is no good time to bring down this indictment. It's not like the American people are unaware of the fact that this is looming. I mean, so many people tuned into the 8 hours, 8+, whether it's 8 or 11, it was still a long time, the Benghazi testimony. Remember that? Where Mrs. Clinton kept her cool all day long answering those questions. A move that many people said made her look like the victim and only strengthened her numbers in the polls. So you got to believe that if it looks like timing is suspect, in other words, if it looks like it's done in retaliation or it's done with ill will or malice, that's certainly going to be something that the voters are going to consider in deciding who to vote for.
All right. So if something was to happen, can on the Democratic side, can somebody slip in at the last minute? I mean, can Joe Biden get in?
Well, the answer to that question really does depend on who you ask. There are nuances that some people are floating here that other commentators come on and say, there's no way that would happen. So, that question is probably a good one for Joe Biden. Or, some of the other names that have been floated around, often haphazardly, because remember, you get kind of unusual answers. Like one of the answers, I think was Paul Ryan gave, or maybe it was Mitt Romney, I can't say that I would decline that nomination. I mean, people are saying things that are casting doubt on whether or not this is really a done deal with the candidates that are currently in the race. Now, procedurally, the nuances of what the rules say, again, hard to predict because remember the latest discussion, they're talking about potentially changing the rules. So very hard to predict, but fun to talk about for sure.
Well, it is. All right, Dr. Wendy Patrick, do you think Donald Trump's the nominee on the Republican side?
It's looking like he's the nominee unless something very out of the ordinary happens at the convention. But, if you look at the fact that even this last round of primaries, Ted Cruz did pick up a lot of delegates and some of the other candidates did as well. It's probably too close to call. It's looking like it'll be more of a challenge, I'll put it that way, for him to hit 1237. Maybe mathematically impossible.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you'll have to wait and see. We did see this, though, with Reagan and Ford, when they went into that convention.
Yeah, we did. We saw what happened there. So while it's not unprecedented, it's highly unusual.
All right. All right. Just on another note, I have here that you wanted to comment on the Pope's launch his very first Instagram account.
Yes, that's right. So I'm a big fan of the Pope, and I'm a big fan of his real zest and passion for becoming relevant to the world. And part of that has been through using social media. Now, he launched his Twitter account a couple years back, and he has almost 9 million Twitter followers. Over the weekend, he launched his Instagram account. How long do you think it took him to amass 1 million followers? 12 hours, okay? The standing record had been 24 hours by David Beckham. 12 hours, 1 million followers. That gives you an idea of not only why the Pope is such a rock star, why he is seen as so approachable and so successful, but also how many people really like this Pope and really believe what he stands for. One other thing I wanted to point out is what's on his Instagram account, what's on his Twitter account. Okay, he's not posting photos of his breakfast or selfies. He's posting scripture and asking viewers to pray for him. He's posting edifying things. He's posting godly phraseology and really, inspiring quotes, things that really make him even more of a rock star than he is already, because not only is it endearing that he's on social media, which, by the way, he calls social media God's gift because it's a communication device, but the things he says makes him really all the more wonderful to the viewing public. That's why he's so many followers.
Well, by the way, interestingly enough, he is attracting, again, a lot of young people. And when we kind of look through this, it looks like young people are now being drawn to, let's say, the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, ecumenical churches, because they want structure.
Right. They want structure, and they see him as a kindler and gentler Pope. Now, whether or not the Vatican would dispute that or not, that's the perception. And that's the perception that he really personified when he did his U.S. tour a couple of months back that had most of us glued to the TV set. It was just amazing. So young people really appreciate the freshness with which he addresses some of the issues. And obviously, he's biblical and scriptural, but the fact that he's willing to talk about the tough issues perhaps distinguishes him from other religious figures around the world that maybe they think are more inclined to avoid some of the tough issues instead of handling them head on, as the Pope does. And by the way, you might also wonder, well, who does he follow on Instagram? The answer so far is no one.
Interesting. On the other hand, he's been one of the most political popes we've ever seen. He's kind of poked his nose in some things that's got him some criticism.
That's right. But that's also one of the reasons that people respect the fact that he's not, he's not afraid to tackle some of the tough issues. Poking his nose in some of the things that society wants to talk about in a religious context makes him relevant. But he's also tempers all of that with such humility. I mean, so much humility that regardless of what you think about his positions on some of the issues, everybody is endeared by his absolute humility. And I'm just not talking about the fact that he refuses to live in the papal palace, but really his day-to-day humility, the way he treats other people, the way he behaved on the American tour. Boy, that you probably think that was driving Secret Service crazy with how close he was getting to some of his fans. That had to have been one stressful day for his handlers. Yeah. But that's endearing to the general public, who really likes him, likes what he has to say, and I bet he's going to, also have more than 10 million followers by next weekend, because that's how fast he's going.
All right, Wendy, you're a delight. Thank you so much. The best to you. Happy Easter to you and yours. By the way, our viewers and listeners, you can go to wendypatrickphd.com. wendypatrickphd.com. Great to see you again. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you so much.
Okay, you too. We'll be right back.